I was a potter and a clay worker for over 25 years. In the beginning, it came down through my mum. My mother started making pottery, going to TAFE in 1960. She had studios at home, originally just a little kiln and a stand-up wheel in the laundry, and was making pots on at night and weekends. She then ended up having the shed floor cemented, power put on, and that became her pottery studio. My sister and I would have a little bit of a play with clay, and Mum encouraged us to make pots and enter them into the show, Newcastle show prizes in the kids section and things like that. I didn't do any more with it until the mid-70s. In 1975, I came back from a trip overseas. There was very little work around at that time, so I started making some coil pots, planters with macrame hangings, and that was just basically to get a little bit of money. So I continued just doing that for a while, and I didn't really, I loved doing it, but I didn't really look at it as an ongoing career path. I'm not sure whether Mum thought that it was time I got kicked out, or whether she really did just think this would be a good opportunity for John. But one of her friends had seen an ad for Canberra School of Art ceramics course. At that time it was run by TAFE, so I applied, not really thinking a great deal about it. I had to go down to Canberra for an interview. I went along to both the Canberra School of Art and one of the local galleries where the head of ceramics, Alan Peascod, had an exhibition. When I saw the exhibition of his work, it just blew me away. It was like nothing I'd seen before. I was used to sort of brown stoneware, reduced stoneware, Japanese influenced ceramics. Alan Peascod's was anything but that. It was stoneware and it was reduced, but it was really colourful in the intensity of the copper barium blues that he was using, and all the forms were influenced by his travels in the Middle East. It really inspired me, and I thought, yeah, I really want to go and do this course. So I sort of had the interview, and they were happy enough to have me come to the course. It was a 2-year course. I didn't last the 2 years. Alan was a kind of a bit of a difficult character to get along with at times, and we ended up clashing heads, and I left. I came back up to Newcastle and spent some time working in Mum's studio making pots. While I was still living in Canberra, I heard about an opportunity to go and work in Victoria on the arts train, teaching ceramics, teaching pottery, and I took that up, and I ended up doing 3 or 4 trips, not all of them while I was living in Canberra. Some came later when I was living up at Salisbury. After a little while in Mum's studio, it was really good there. We got on very well, and I made my pots, she made her pots. Because I'd had quite a bit more training in detail of things like clay and glazes, the technology of them, the chemistry, I was able to help her out with some of her glazes, and so we shared that sort of both the love of making but also technical things, and she showed me how to fire her kiln and things like that. So it was a good partnership. All the while I was hoping to get a studio somewhere out in the country. I wanted to go bush, I wanted to get out of the city. So I kept going up the valley looking around for places. I'd chosen the Hunter Valley as where I wanted to be. I ended up going up one time just out of Dungog, heading towards the Barrington Mountains, the foothills, a little place called Salisbury, and I spotted a farmhouse up on the top of a hill, looking a bit derelict and empty. So I asked around, and one of the local farmers said, yep, that's Lindsay Muddles, he's round fixing fences. We've just had a flood and he's fixing fences. Go and see him. So I went and saw him and told him what I wanted to do, and he was kind of agreeable, and I said, okay, well, how much do you want for rent? And it was quite funny because he sort of looked at me for a while, and you could see the cogs going round, and he said, $7 a week. So what he decided on was $1 a day, which was cheap even then. I mean, this was 1979, I think. Yeah. So I went up. The house hadn't been lived in for nearly 2 years. Cows had literally been walking and shitting through the house, so I had a big clean-up job to do. I had 2 rooms that I used, so kind of half the house was used as my studio. I built a 10 cubic foot gas-fired sprung arch kiln. Worked okay, and I produced stoneware, bowls, cups, lidded jars, all that sort of thing, and sold them mainly in Newcastle, at a couple of outlets in Newcastle. While I was up there, I had my first exhibition at Von Berto Galleries. I was producing a line of work that was not my production work. It was very much influenced by Alan Peascod and the Islamic forms. It was well received, and I went on to have more exhibitions at Von Berto Galleries. The work I was doing at the time for exhibitions was mainly dry glaze. That's a glaze with a very matte surface, has no sheen whatsoever. It sprung out of working in Canberra and being influenced by Alan Peascod's work. I made a whole series that was based on underwater archaeology, so looking at the wave pots that were found from ancient Greece, etc., in the Mediterranean, all the accretions that built up on them. The other area that I worked in was lustres. Sometimes the lustre was just there as accents, and at other times the lustre was overall, the whole pot was covered in lustre. I also applied for and got some part-time work at what was then the CAE, later to become the university, and teaching ceramics. At that stage it was in Union Street, Newcastle, and was headed up, the ceramics section was headed up by an Englishman named Robert Ruthven. We got on quite well, and I ended up working there for a few years teaching at the CAE. The other teaching job that I had at the time was one day a week I was at Uwarra Training School for Boys. It was a juvenile justice institution for 15 to 17-year-old, so pre-jail. It was an open place. There was no big walls or anything like, or cells or anything like that. And the boys there did various studies during the day. They had classrooms there and had teachers, not only in school things, but also in things like trades and whatnot. So preparing them for a better life outside. I had pottery classes there, morning and afternoon, 2 different groups of boys. The other event that occurred while I was living up at Salisbury was I got married, and it was a bit of a disaster, first marriage. When that broke up, I actually had a break. I sold up all my ceramics gear, came back down to live in Newcastle, and got a job working for a company that were doing the natural gas conversion around Newcastle and the coalfields. I actually got that job and became a team leader because of my ceramics practice, because I had dealt with gas kilns and was familiar with working with gas fittings and working with gas. Things like the safety of working with gas was paramount. That job lasted for nearly 3 years. During the time of that job, I had met my second wife and we got married and we bought a house. Part of the reason for buying that house was that living opposite us were a couple, and the fellow, Phil, was a potter, and I knew him from surfing and from potting, and his wife was a lady that my wife had gone through high school with, very close friends. Phil had got me kind of back interested in potting again. He was a lover of wood kilns and at the time salt firing, and he had built a quite large wood-fired salt kiln, and he asked me would I come and help him fill it for the first firing. It was kind of it was sort of like the gateway drug to getting back into ceramics for me. I went along and he had his studio just on the veranda of his old house, and go there and throw a whole lot of stuff, and kept on throwing until we got enough to fill the kiln and fire it. Then when we bought the house that we bought, part of the reason for buying it was that they were there, but it also was on a double block, and right at the back of the block it had a double garage. Not easily accessed by a vehicle. It was quite a steep backyard, and that was what I had set out for my studio. We had to connect power to it and do a couple of other things, but once got that happening, I bought a porter kiln. I can't remember how big it was. I think it was 18 cubic foot or something like that, and started making work, lots of work. Had put in drying racks, workbenches, all sorts of things like that. Got it. It was quite a good studio. It was a great studio, in fact. While I was there, I was first still working in stoneware, reduced stoneware. One of the things that had really interested me in ceramics was the Italian Renaissance maiolica. So white glaze with, in those days, oxides painted over. The ones that really interested me were the platters, the storiato platters, the story platters. They were telling stories. So I started looking at using some of the patterning from the Middle East and the techniques of maiolica, and started producing stoneware. Not true maiolica because it was stoneware, not earthenware. And I was still in that mould of thinking that if I was producing production work for domestic wear, it should be stoneware so it's durable and won't chip easily, vases will hold water, etc. I decided that I would like to get back into doing some part-time teaching, lecturing at what had now come from CAA, had become uni, and also the TAFE. I applied at TAFE and was accepted and got into there. But uni said, no, you can't do that. You don't hold a qualification, and if you're going to teach a degree course, you need to at least have your degree. So I enrolled in the Bachelor of Arts, Visual Arts at University of Newcastle. That is a 3-year course. It was kind of bad timing in a way. It made things very difficult for us. My first son was born. We had agreed that my wife would have the first 12 months of his life not working. She was a nurse, so that she could be with him. Then I started uni, so I wasn't at home to work all the time. So what I was trying to do was do my uni work over at uni, go to the lectures and all that sort of thing, and then fly home and make lots of pots. I'd set up some markets in Sydney. I was selling it, ended up with about half a dozen places down in Sydney that I would sell, and every 2 to 3 months I would go down with a station wagon full of pots and sell them. And back in those days you got paid cash, which was really nice. So it was a little bit difficult, but we got through it. During my time at uni, I started investigating further into the maiolica, and I was actually making earthenware work there. The work that I ended up doing as my final year assessment work, I called it my Baroque series. Very decorative, lots of decoration on it. It was a little bit like the old Islamic thing of horror vacui, horror of an empty space. So they were very heavily decorated with the oxides and stains I was using, and then with gold lustre over the top. The rationale behind the work, in a way, was that it was the 80s. This was the mid-80s, 86, 87, 88, 89, all that sort of time. The thing at the time was greed is good, you know, there's this affluence and people were sort of really hand over fist trying to make money, and it was becoming capitalism in super bloom. And I didn't agree with that. I didn't like that as a prime mover for a society. The other thing that I had been investigating was the use of religious iconography within visual arts as a whole. And there had been quite a resurgence in people using it, not necessarily to promote religions, but more, it was almost like people needed to have something to believe in, but didn't quite believe in the old religions. And there was lots of talk of new religions and lots of writers, critical writers, that were writing about that sort of thing where needs to be a new religion. So I was looking at those sort of factors, and the work I produced was, the physical thing was, they came from Majolica, but also the Japanese Jomon vessels, very highly decorated, sort of based on functional vessels, but no longer functional because of the amount of decoration, bits added onto them and all that sort of thing. So I saw that as, again, as a metaphor for that sort of excess. I had been looking in particular at the Baroque period, which is very excessive. The interior of Baroque churches just absolutely over the top with decoration. That series became known as my Baroque series, and they were about the excessive consumption at the time, but also sort of slightly iconic vessels that might have some sort of religious or spiritual significance, iconic significance. I really only produced one series, maybe 20 pieces of that. They were intensely time consuming. I was really pleased with how they ended up. I had an exhibition the year after I finished my Bachelor of Arts, Visual Arts. I had an exhibition at Raglan Gallery in Manly and had a number of those pieces in that exhibition. They got lots of critical acclaim, not a huge amount of sales. They were all fairly large vessels, they weren't small. One of the ones that I did in that was called Over the Top Teapot, and it was in a teapot exhibition. And the teapot was, the over the top teapot was huge, it was heavy, it was super ornate, had lots of gold, so really not very practical at all. So again, it was just looking at that theme of sort of overabundance, over capitalism, over consumerism. The other work that I had been developing before I switched right over to earthenware was a range of stoneware pieces that had the imagery becoming much less just patterns, but more story. I exhibited a number of those in the Raglan Gallery exhibition too. Not too long after that, I switched over to using earthenware, partly because of the historical significance of it, but also the ability to get a greater layering of colours and more intense colours, but also more subtle colours too, that I couldn't quite get using stoneware. I've always loved bowls, so there's lots of bowls, shallow platters, some quite large, some just domestic sized. For exhibition pieces I used lustre, and even one of the Raglan Gallery where I had the show, she also had a sort of a stock area that she sold work from, and she bought quite a lot of the work that was lustre and that, so it was kind of special domestic wear, if you like. It was domestic forms, they still were functional forms, but lots of people would have bought them just to look at. Mura Gallery in Newtown was again one of the galleries that really supported my work, and I started having exhibitions there, and I think I ended up having 4 or 5 there. In 1989, Newcastle had an earthquake which really damaged a lot of buildings in a lot of places, and one place in particular was Hamilton. And I was asked by a friend of mine to join him in doing a thing that was called the Creative Pavement Study, and basically there was some money available through grants to sort of try and get Beaumont Street, which had been closed 6 or 7 weeks or something like that, had been closed for quite a number of weeks. And a lot of shop owners actually went out of business, and they wanted to try and kickstart it and get it looking really good. So we were given a commission to do that. Paul was working in mosaics in the footpath, and so I started looking at mosaics for planter pots. And in particular I was looking at the mosaics of Gaudi in Barcelona, and was very much influenced by that. Ended up doing, I think it ended up something like 24 of the planters in Beaumont Street. And for each of the planters I was making the top surround of tiles, and each side of the planter had a plate, hand-thrown plate, hand-decorated plate. And what I was doing with those was looking at one of two things. It was either looking at the cultural, ethnic background of the people whose shops these were going in front of, or it was looking at what the shop did. So, you know, there's one, for example, that was Pete's Perfect Pastries, so it had images of cakes and things like that. That led to just lots and lots of commissions, really. The Kent Hotel commissioned some planters, but they also, seeing the quality of work I could produce and do various things, they got me to make some works for inside the hotel. And when the hotelier also purchased another hotel in further up Beaumont Street, the Exchange, I was commissioned to do works for that as well. And they all sprung out of the Beaumont Street Creative Pavement one, as did a number of private commissions. I did splashbacks for people, I did tile panels. And by that time, because I was doing the tiles around the top of them, I was doing quite a lot of tile work. That actually led on to doing a commission for the Workers' Club that had been destroyed in the earthquake, with 2 other artists who were commissioned to make artworks, and part of that was me working with a painter, Birgitta Hansen, to produce quite a large tile mural. The other side of that was that I had designed and was having to produce a series of planters, large planters, metre high, metre wide planters. I didn't have the wherewithal to do the throwing for that, both the physical strength and the large kiln and handling gear and space and all that sort of thing. So I put that out to tender and got Cameron Williams from Sydney did the throwing for me and firing. And I went down and worked with him. He would be doing the throwing of them once they were a little bit firm. They were thrown upside down, which was a bit funny, but I had to decorate them upside down. But that was a good experience. By then I'd then started to have quite a wide sort of ranging practice. So I was throwing domestic ware, coffee mugs and things like that. I was making exhibition thrown work. I was doing tile panel work. I was doing large commissions, and I was doing mosaics. It was really nice the way the practice had developed like that. At the same time as all that, I was doing part-time lecturing at uni and at TAFE. While I was working at uni, I wanted to have a break from the Mayalika and thrown work. I'd been doing it for some time, and I'd sort of felt that I'd taken it as far as I wanted to take it at the time. Part of working within the uni in particular, but also at TAFE, was the fact that you got to see a lot of people doing a lot of different things. Uni in particular had in fact, they did not particularly like people making thrown ceramics. There's a huge throwing room with all these lovely Brent wheels and everything, but the emphasis really was on sculptural ceramics, conceptual sculptural ceramics. And so it was really interesting to see some of the techniques, some of the things that were being done in that arena. And that's what got me interested in using perlite clay. So it was a mix of perlite and clay, which allowed you to build really thick walled pieces and build very fast. And it was quite strong. Didn't use any sort of traditional methods. You couldn't roll a coil with it. You couldn't really cut slabs with it or anything like that. So it was sort of build up as you go. And I ended up doing a series. The series I called the Newcastle Harbour series, and they were based around activities in the harbour. Newcastle, we're quite lucky, we've got a working harbour very close to the CBD. And it was always interesting, had been of interest to me. I had also, at one stage, before I even went to Canberra and started potting, I had worked at the State Dockyard shipbuilding for a few months. I was saving money to go overseas. And it was always interesting to me watching the boats come in and whatnot. And one of the things that always kind of stuck in my mind was the fact that this is something that's been going on for centuries. The trade in goods between countries and it being brought in by ship. So it was always really interesting seeing things come in, get unloaded off the ships onto the wharves, etc. So I started looking at that, and I started thinking about the sorts of things that we do trade in. But part of it too was, and part of the reason for using the perlite clay, apart from just having a play with it and using it for its technique and its technical abilities, was that I wanted something really simple, chunky, not refined at all. Because my mindset when I was doing that series of work was that even though we've become a very sophisticated species, we're getting things up on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Computers were just starting to come in and all that sort of thing, so it was just really, like all this stuff, very sophisticated, but here it is, we still did that really basic thing of trading things for shelter, for food, for defence, and the series was built around that. The other thing, of course, Newcastle being a coal port, there was always ships on the horizon. I was a surfer. You go to the beach and every day there'd be 10 to 20 ships sitting out in the horizon waiting for their turn to come in and unload. The series was kind of built around the column shape, and again that was a reference back to sort of classical times, Roman columns holding up buildings, being that thing of stability, holding up society. And they all had ships sort of within them somewhere, and they were assemblages, so I was looking at sort of placing things in odd conjunctions in a way. So for example, you've got one that's the columns, instead of columns they became the columns of the wheat silos, and so it was like the wheat silos were there, and up on top of it is a loaf of bread, because that's what the flour is going to be used for from the wheat, and it had a ship on it as well. I did various other ones that looked at different things within that, and that series was exhibited in Sydney and it was exhibited in Newcastle. Unfortunately, it didn't do too well. In fact, I don't think I sold one of them, and that was a bit of a disappointment. I would have liked to have kept going, but through all of this, we were buying the house, and the the interest rates at that time went up to 17.5%, and it was just mind-numbingly hard to get ahead. So there was a lot of pressure, a lot of financial pressure. And in the end, that got too much. To try and alleviate some of that stress, I looked around and thought, what else can I do? Uni and TAFE were starting to get into a bit of a decline. The hours that were being given as part-timers were reducing. I looked around and thought about the fact that there was a pottery supplies shop in Newcastle and they were selling up. And I talked it over with my wife and we decided that yes, we would buy this shop and we would run the shop. She would work in the shop at times when she wasn't working at her job nursing, to allow me times to work at uni and TAFE and also studio time. The sale of the shop didn't go through. We decided that it wouldn't go through because what he was trying to sell was not what we really wanted. So ended up starting another clay shop in Adamstown, and that's what I ended up calling it, because they're so used to everybody in TAFE, they'd say, oh, I'm just ducking over to the clay shop to buy some clay. And so that's what I called my shop, the clay shop. And I had that for 3 or 4 years, and I had classes there, I had my studio there, sold pottery supplies, and it was supplying quite a few schools and things. Unfortunately, my marriage broke down and I was still in the shop at that time but wasn't focusing on running it very well and things like that, so it was starting to accrue debt. And the whole thing of the pressure of working within that area kind of got to me. And the other thing was that I'd restarted making Mayolica work again, and I just sort of felt that I'd run my course with clay. I'd been doing it for a long time. I had been around clay even longer than I'd been doing it because of Mum's involvement. So I just thought, no, I'll just give it a miss. And the other thing was that, again, because of the reduced hours in TAFE and uni, I had done my dip ed teacher education. The aim was not really to become a full-time teacher. The aim was to get casual work that would supplement my making. When the marriage broke up and the shop eventually shut, I was relying totally on secondary school teaching. I didn't have a studio. I didn't really have space for making or anything like that, so I just let it go basically and was concentrating on the teaching. A full-time position came up at Hunter Valley Grammar School and I took that. Once you're full-time teaching, there's just no time for doing a lot else. It's really full on. Really since 2004, my only real involvement with ceramics has been demonstrating, teaching units of work at schools for ceramics. I had to leave teaching in 2011. 2010 I had a brain bleed and had a number of attempts at going back to work but didn't work, so I had to leave. And once I recovered a bit more from that, I actually started doing some workshops at Lake Macquarie Gallery and did some teaching there, and occasionally was teaching ceramics as well as other visual arts things. The other thing was, I don't know when it was, but it was quite a few years after I had left Hunter Valley Grammar. I was talking to my head teacher and she said, would you like to do some after school classes? That ended up happening, and I was going up once a week to teach ceramics class for kids after school as an interest project for them. And that was good fun because it kept me in touch a little bit with ceramics. I've always enjoyed teaching. I've enjoyed passing on the skills and knowledge that I've had in ceramics. And it was always exciting to see. I'd set them projects and see what their reactions to that were in clay. They came up with some wonderful stuff. Every now and again I kind of miss ceramics and I miss potting. I did some travelling in my camper van in 2013. I was basically away backwards and forwards, but mostly away for bit over 6 months. When I got back, I decided, while I was away, I'd sort of decided that I'd like to have a bit of a play again, so I went and did some throwing, and that was kind of funny. So I hadn't really thrown anything for probably nearly 10 years at that stage. Yeah, it was a bit wonky, but got there. Then again, still every now and again I would get this little urge to do some throwing, and I was talking to Sue Stewart, good friend who'd gone through kind of a similar thing to me. Although she'd trained in Newcastle at TAFE, then gone to uni, and then became working at uni and also working at TAFE, so we kind of went along parallel paths. Sue found a wheel for me, and I had it in I still have, it's in the shed here where I live. Got a good shed, it'd be a great studio, but don't really want to spend the money on fitting out a whole studio when I probably wouldn't use it all that much. I had great intentions, and the wheel sat here for, I think I've had it for maybe 3 years, maybe even more now, and I've probably only used it 2 or 3 times. When I look at things and I watch things, sometimes I watch videos with people making. I still have close contact with a few of my friends from the clay days, and they're still working in clay. And I still love it. I still love looking at things with clay, and I've got miles and miles of it around the house. My mother collected a lot of ceramics, and I collected some. When Mum passed on, I got all her collection, so I've got miles of clay. I'm surrounded, it's like a museum. I think I'll always have that interest and love of ceramics, but I can never see me getting back into it in any real way. Since having the first brain bleed, I've had another 2, and that's really started to affect me, both cognition and physical abilities. One of the things that happened while I was teaching was I kind of kept on getting sort of moved into the area of photography and video, and that started happening in darkroom photography. 3 of the schools that I did some teaching at all had dark rooms and were teaching photography, so I always had a bit of an interest in photography, but never really did a great deal with it. I think I did a term of photography at uni in my BAVA. But I became more interested in it, and particularly when I had to teach more of it when I was full-time at Hunter Valley Grammar, I got a lot more into photography and video, and I'd never done any video. And the first year that I was up there, I had to teach a Year 11 video unit of work for a term. So I had to run out and buy myself a video camera so I could practice at home and be one step ahead of the kids in both shooting video and also editing, and that's become my mainstay over those years. Where it really led me to was one of my main areas was working with doing interviews with artists, and I did them for galleries, and I did them just as passion projects. But I never really got to interview anyone with making pots. I will do that at some stage. The one time that I did get to do it was with Newcastle Art Gallery. I was commissioned to do an interview with a Japanese ceramicist who had come out to install an artwork, ceramic artwork, as part of a show of the Soda Isha group of ceramic sculptors. They were a group that were post-war, and they were in Japan, which is really, really traditional, centuries back of ceramic tradition. And they were a radical group of sculptors that were using clay in whole different ways to what the rest of Japan was. It was really interesting doing that because it combined my 2 loves. My ceramic background allowed me to ask questions of him that quite possibly someone without a ceramic background wouldn't have delved into. I'll always love ceramics. I'll go to occasional ceramic exhibitions. I always notice ceramics when I see them places and think about how they've been made and who made them and whatnot. I'm on a Facebook page, Australian Pottery Collectors, and sometimes we'll give advice on there. But look at all the things people are collecting, and yeah, it's been a big part of my life and always will be. But I'll never get back into it, I don't think. Should never say that. Should never say never. My mother stopped potting in the 80s because of arthritis. Her body gave way on her, and it was a bit ironical because she'd given up work to do pottery full time, and within 2 years couldn't pot. Mum stopped potting, like I say, in the 80s, mid 80s. In 2018, she was in care. She had to go into care. She was having some problems with dementia and also physical problems. She'd had both hips replaced. She was very frail. But she asked me one day to bring some clay over. She was bored. She was just sitting looking at the four walls of the room that she was in, and she was bored. So I took some clay over and she started making again. And it was really lovely. She was, by this time, she was in her late 80s. She was probably 89, 90, just 2 weeks short of her 92nd birthday when she passed away. And she had been making up until probably a month or two before she passed away. She'd still been making things out of clay. So never say never. But yeah, clay, it's in my blood, always will be.